Good morning, ladies. Good morning. This piece is entitled Where I'm From. I live as a ward of a Congress that in many cases caters more to the needs of the politicians that move there upon their election than to the city's native residents. I come from the home of go-go music and Ben's Chili Bowl in Jennison. A salad bowl where popular culture and all other kinds of culture intermingle all the time, depending on what part of the city you're from. I'm from a place where politicians and winos and students and convicts and corporate professionals frequent the same McDonald's. I live where public school closings, activism, poverty, faith, mass incarceration are equal realities. I live where music and art flourish in the streets but die in some schools. I live where slavery and freedom were once and sometimes still are synonymous. I live where community is sacred, but depending on who you are, only when it's yours. I live in the home of the Smithsonian museums and thousands of people with skewed views and limited understandings on their own history. I'm from the city that so many are trying to get out of and that so many more are trying to get into. I live on the face of the nation that carries more blemishes than a pubescent boy, but projects the alabaster countenance of a model in Vanity Fair. I live where hope is around every historic and gentrified corner. I live in the home of the Electoral College, the hub of a country that says it values democracy, but has been unable to give them that right. I live in the seat of many a beautiful, struggling, surviving contradiction, and I am not ashamed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sierra. It's a wonderful poem. Good morning. Good morning. On behalf of the Division of Humanities at Bennett College, I would like to thank you all for being here today. It is my pleasure to introduce to you a very special guest speaker, Dr. Watson Jennison, Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. At UNCG, he specializes in teaching undergraduate and graduate courses in African American history and the history of the South. Race, the expansion of slavery in Georgia, 1750 to 18. Jennison examines the roles of race, slavery, and class in the economic, geographic, and political development of Georgia from the colonial era through the antebellum era. Currently, Dr. Jennison is conducting research on the Black 1970s. In fact, he joins us today immediately on the heels of a trip to the Meaning of Blackness Conference in Costa Rica, where he presented a paper entitled The Limits of Blackness, Disagreement and Disillusionment at the 6th Pan-African Congress. His scholarly work, Dr. Jennison has served as the mentor of my doctoral studies as well as my dissertation advisor. As a mentor, he is an educator whose personal interest in my academic, professional, and personal growth is an invaluable asset. It is with great pride that I present him to you today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennison to Bennett College this morning.
Thank you for those kind words, Carrie. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start off by thanking Bennett College and the organizers of this event for inviting me to speak to you. Currently, we are in the midst of a season of anniversaries and historic celebrations related to the Civil Rights Movement. In 2010, the nation celebrated the 50th anniversary of the bravery and resilience of 4 young men who led a protest against Woolworth's refusal to serve blacks at their whites-only lunch counter. In 2011, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides across the South, which sought to integrate bus service in the region. In 2013, we celebrated the 50th anniversary for Jobs and Freedom and Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. This year, we will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which banned the segregation of public accommodations. Many regard the Civil Rights Act as the crowning achievement of the Black freedom struggle. Contrary to this perception, however, it is the Voting Rights Act, whose anniversary we will celebrate next year, that brought about the most profound change in Black life in the 20th century. Of political oppression that Black Southerners had faced since the rise of Jim Crow in the late 19th century. Black Southerners had made impressive gains during Reconstruction, a time in which African Americans were recognized as citizens and fought for all the rights and privileges of citizenship, including the vote, which they regarded as essential in protecting their freedom. By the turn of the century, however, whites had rolled back many of the achievements of Reconstruction through the imposition of legislation mandating segregation and disfranchisement. By 1910, nearly all Black men were disfranchised in the former Confederate States. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 and signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on August 6th. The act prohibited states from imposing requirements and other from registering to vote and established federal oversight over elections. The law was amended 5 times, most recently in 2006, when Congress reauthorized it for 25 years. The vote in favor of reauthorization was overwhelming in both chambers of Congress, among Democrats and Republicans alike. The vote in the House was 394 and only 33 opposed, and in the Senate, it was unanimous in favor. When he signed the renewed version of the law, George W. Bush declared that it was, quote, an example of our continued commitment to a united America where every person is valued and treated with dignity and respect, unquote. The 3 most important provisions in the law are Sections 2, 4, and 5. Section 2 prohibits voter discrimination based on race, color, or language. In effect, this 15th Amendment, which was passed during the Reconstruction era, but ignored by the early 20th century. Section 4 lays out the coverage formula that determined which states and counties would be subject to federal oversight. There were 2 criteria for inclusion among the states that would fall within this category. The first was jurisdictions that used tests or devices to restrict the opportunity to register to vote. The second was jurisdictions where less than half of eligible voters registered or voted in the 1964 presidential election. Section 5 was perhaps the most important. Section 5 requires those areas to seek pre-clearance before altering their election law, regardless of how small the change. In effect, these areas had to ask the Justice Department or federal district court in Washington, D.C. for permission before implementing new voting laws, even seemingly minor ones, like moving polling places. The Voting Rights Act directed 9 whole states, 7 of them southern, and portions of another 6 states, including North Carolina, where 40 counties fell under the purview of the law. The law also includes parts of California, Florida, New York, Michigan, and South Dakota. For the Voting Rights Act to have an impact on Black political participation in the United States, particularly in the South. Between 1964 and 1969, across the region, the number of Black adults registered to vote grew tremendously. The increase was most pronounced in the states of the Deep South. In Alabama, the percentage jumped from 19% to 61%. In Georgia, from 27% to 60%. And in Mississippi, from 6% to 66%. Not only were Black Americans voting at record levels in the wake of the law's passage, they were holding office too. At the federal level, Black men and women entered Congress in numbers not seen since Reconstruction. By 1972, there were 13 Black members of Congress, including Andrew Young and Barbara Jordan, who were the first 2 Black representatives to be elected to the body from the former Confederate States in over 70 years. The growth in the number of Black men and women in Congress gave rise to the creation of the Congressional Black Caucus in 1971. whose members continued to increase in the decades that followed its founding. By 1997, in fact, the number of black congressmen and women had grown to 40. At the great strides in terms of holding office. Black Southerners especially made tremendous gains. In the 11 former states of the Confederacy, the number of blacks elected to state legislatures increased from 3 in 1965 to 176 in 1985. But it was at the local level that the Voting Rights Act had its greatest impact. By 1974, more than 1,500 blacks held public office in the South alone. One of the earliest success stories was the Black Panthers, but not the first Black Panthers were organized in Lowndes County, Alabama, as part of the Freedom Summer of 1964. They worked with members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to form the independent Lowndes County Freedom Organization to compete against the white-dominated Democratic Party. The group chose the Black Panther as its insignia, an emblem of fierce racial pride, and at the end of the decade succeeded in electing one of their own to the most critical county office there was, sheriff. Success at the ballot box for black candidates extended to urban areas as well. One of the most notable victories occurred in Atlanta in 1973 when Maynard Jackson became the first black mayor of a major southern city. 3 terms before retiring, and played a critical role in the city's revitalization. During his time in office, Jackson implemented new affirmative action policies that altered the way city government minority-owned companies opportunities to profit from government-sponsored projects for the first time. Among his many achievements, Jackson oversaw the construction of several public works projects, including the rebuilding of Hartsfield Atlanta International Airport, now known as Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International. Jackson was part of a tide of black mayors that swept into office in the late 1960s and early 1970s across the country. The first 2 were Richard Hatcher and Carl Stokes, who in 1967 were elected mayors of Gary, Indiana, and Cleveland, Ohio, respectively. In 1975, the number of black mayors grew exponentially from 8 to 135. A staggering increase in a short period of time. Among this group was Coleman Young, who was elected mayor of Detroit in 1973, and Thomas Bradley, who took over the helm of Los Angeles that same year. The pattern continued into the next decade when Harold Washington was elected mayor of Chicago in 1983, and 6 years later when David Dinkins took power in New York City. Atlanta, Washington, and a number of other cities with black majorities and the most obvious form of black political organizing, came to be known by what the band Parliament called chocolate cities. As they declared, you don't need the bullet when you got the ballot. The number of elected officials as well. The number of elected officials grew as well, increasing from 1,469 in 1970 to 4,912 in 1980. By 2011, the number had reached approximately 10,500. In spite of the Voting Rights Act, black Americans continue to face obstacles to their full participation in the political process. One obstacle is felony disfranchisement. An estimated 5.8 million people are ineligible to vote because of felony convictions. About 2 million of these individuals are black. 3/4 of those disfranchised are no longer incarcerated. In 10 states, rates of disenfranchisement reach more than 15% of the black population, including Florida, Kentucky, and Virginia, where rates exceed 20%. Overall, 1.4 million, or 13% of all black men, are disenfranchised, a rate 7 times the national average. Felony disfranchisement laws vary from state to state, but are generally more restrictive in the South, where lawmakers placed them on the books in the aftermath of the Civil War as a means of preventing black men from voting. One of the harshest examples is in Mississippi. Permanently lose their right to vote for writing a bad check for as little as $100. In Florida, Kentucky, and Virginia, felons are effectively barred from voting for life, even after they have served their time and are no longer on probation. By contrast, prisoners in Maine and Vermont, two very white states, are still allowed to vote even from prison. Consequently, felony disfranchisement laws have a disproportionate impact on blacks and have shaped our elections as well. In fact, the election of 2000, which gave George W. Bush the presidency, would probably have gone to Al Gore had the provisions for felony disfranchisement in Florida not been so extreme. The impact of felony disfranchisement has been exacerbated by the country's war on drugs, which disproportionately targets minorities, particularly black men. Since 1980, the size of the nation's prison population has grown more than 500%, from around 400,000 to more than 2 million today. Much of this increase has been due to mass incarceration connected to nonviolent drug offenses. In 1980, the number of people in prison or jail for drug offenses was 41,000. By 2011, the number had grown to 499,000. At the federal level, prisoners incarcerated on drug charges comprise half of the population, while the number in state prisons has increased 13-fold since 1980. The war on drugs in the 1980s targeted those who consumed or sold crack cocaine. Increasingly, the war on drugs in our own time targets those who use or sell marijuana. Recent studies have shown that blacks are on average almost 4 marijuana possession than whites, despite the fact that whites consume the drug at the same level or more than blacks. In some counties, the discrepancy in arrests was 10 to 30 times greater. In 2 Alabama counties, 100% of those arrested for marijuana possession were black. Attacks on the Voting Rights Act itself constitute a second and more detrimental threat to black political participation. In recent years, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court has shown a desire and a willingness to reverse long-standing protections related to civil and political rights. In the most serious blow to date, the court ruled 5-4 in the case of Shelby versus Holder in June 2013 that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, that's the part that covers the coverage formula, ruling it unconstitutional. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion of the conservative majority. He claimed that the data used in Section 4 was dated and that the country had moved on from the rampant racism that had infected the political process in the 1960s. Roberts wrote in his decision, "Our country has changed." He pointed to data that detailed much higher rates of black participation in the political process. In 1964, only 6.4% of blacks in Mississippi were registered, compared with over 60% of whites. In 2004, however, the percentage of black voters there reached 76%, 4 points higher than whites. In 2012, black turnout was higher than white turnout in 5 of the states first covered by the Voting Rights Act law. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg railed against the majority's reasoning. Ginsburg criticized in her dissent, comparing discarding the law with, quote, throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet, unquote. The conservative majority failed to consider the new ways in which racial discrimination was affected at the polls. Instead of preventing blacks from registering or blocking their vote through violence or coercion, the new methods are more insidious and gerrymandering and at-large voting. Critics believed, like Ginsburg, that the decision would lead to efforts to support. The months that followed bore out their predictions. It did not take long for Southern Republicans to capitalize upon the Supreme Court's decision. Texas led the way just 2 hours after the law had been ruled unconstitutional. It reintroduced voter restrictions that the Justice Department had previously prohibited. As a result of a population increase, Texas gained 4 new congressional districts in 2010. Division drew 3 of the new 4 districts with white majorities, even though most of the population growth came from an increase in the state's Hispanic population. The second part of the new election law in Texas requires all voters to show a photo ID to cast a ballot. Any ID or photo ID. Driver's licenses, military identification cards, passports, and concealed handgun licenses, but not college IDs from state universities or colleges. It calls for a government agency to issue IDs free of charge, but the locations are not necessarily accessible to everyone in the state. Travel upwards of 250 miles round trip to get the ID. The law will result in fees for those voters who lack proper documentation. A poll tax in effect. Paying $22 for a certified copy of their birth certificate. In Texas alone, there are 600,000 to 800,000 registered voters who do not possess the necessary identification, most of them black and brown. Across the region have followed suit. Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, and sadly North Carolina have all introduced new restrictions on. Despite its reputation as the South's most progressive state, North Carolina has recently passed one of the most restrictive new voter laws in the country. In 2010, Republicans in the General Assembly had passed a voter ID law, but then Governor Beverly Perdue vetoed it, and the legislature failed to override her veto. Last year, in 2013, in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision, Republicans in North Carolina renewed their efforts identification to vote. The law instituted more restrictive requirements for identification that had originally been passed and vetoed. The law, like Texas, banned the use of college IDs, even from state schools. A North Carolina Board of Elections study in April, 1,000 registered voters in the state did not have DMV-issued ID, many of them black. The law also drastically limits the days for early voting, cutting the first 7 days, including the Sunday before the election, a day when black churches often organize their congregations to vote together. The law also halted same-day registration and banned the option of provisional ballots for those who show up at the wrong polling place. The law was already draconian, considering there have been no reported cases of voter impersonation in the state. But in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's ruling invalidating Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, the Republican majority made the law even more severe. Although supporters of the law claim that voter IDs are necessary to prevent fraud, there is virtually no evidence that impersonation has taken place to any significant degree. Moreover, the law takes no action to prevent voter fraud through absentee voting, perhaps the easiest opportunity for voter fraud, but not coincidentally a form of voting used by elderly white voters, a segment of the population that votes. In his appearance last year on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, Don Yelton, a Republican official from Buncombe County, revealed the intentions of the law when he acknowledged on air that if the new voter ID, quote, hurts a bunch of lazy blacks that want the government, so be it, unquote. He said that on the air. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that all is not lost. There is hope. I have come today not to whine about this reversal, but to rally for change. The most important force for change is the people. That's us, that's you. We can push to turn back these discriminatory laws. You, as the next generation, must act to preserve and extend the rights that were fought for and gained so long ago. Take the struggle to the next stage. This entails organizing, just like our predecessors, to register voters and get out the vote. Attorney General Eric Holder has recently announced a lawsuit against the new voter restrictions passed in Texas and North Carolina. This is the new civil rights struggle of our time. We must champion the rights of minority voters and challenge the modern-day disfranchisement, drag us into a new Jim Crow era. Thank you.
Dr. Jennison's work reminds us of the tremendous gains made by African Americans as a result of the Voting Rights Act. Excuse me. Current events in the news, felony disenfranchisement, the actions of conservative state legislatures, and the Moral Monday movement demonstrate that those gains continue to be threatened. It is the partnership of the scholarship and political action that happens on the college campus and on the courthouse steps where those injustices might be targeted as students and professors rise up in unison. I'm actually going to cede my comments and allow a little bit of a change in the program, and Ms. Sierra Tony actually has a second poem for us to read. Spring Breaking.
So, I was considering where I might spend spring break this year. The semester's just started and some of us are really just not here. I would love to, get away, find a getaway in the palm trees, escape all the theories school loads me up with week after week. I said to myself, maybe I'll just go home. Back to my capital D.C., that place where family waits for their little girl to return from the world of big ideas and intellectualized solutions. Maybe I'll try something new. Where do people go for spring break? Florida, the Sunshine State. I would go to Miami for the sun, surf, and sand. I'd get a tan, fan myself, and breathe through the break. But to be real, that would be fake. That would be a mistake. How could I find myself on the beaches of MIA when two boys in Florida have gone MIA? Me, oh my, they're dead today. Jordan and Trayvon are dead today because dormant racism has come out to play. I said, what do we do? Hold more voter registration? Yes. But how will we change the minds of a country built on racialized sensation? You tell me.
Thank you. That concludes our program.